Hi, and welcome to the Chapter 24 podcast. This is on the immune system. The picture I have here is an old poster of just telling people to get vaccinated against smallpox. It is really one of the success stories of our immune response, and that is the development of the vaccine for smallpox, which had killed millions and millions of people through our history. So we've kind of eliminated smallpox worldwide. Now, why are these Marines being vaccinated for smallpox? It's because some people think that it could be used as a biological threat in the future. This is what smallpox virus looks like, and the goal of not only our acquired immunity, but any making of a vaccine is to recognize this shape, and so we're never infected by that again. This right here is a picture, an outline of a human body, and this is a castle, and both of them share the same goal. The goal of a castle is to protect everything inside and keep the enemies from infiltrating the castle. The goal of your body is to do the same thing. And so what is an infection? It's when something outside our body eventually gets inside our body and makes us sick. And so just like our skin offers us protection against any invaders, the castle walls provide that same protection. But that's not where it ends. Our skin actually produces a very low pH environment on the outside where it's hard for those organisms to live. We also secrete chemicals called lysozymes. That's kind of like the moat around the castle or the flaming tar that we're shooting on the invaders. And so the goal is to keep everything outside of our body. But once it gets inside, then we get to our second layer of protection. Our second layer of protection are going to be all these soldiers that are going to pour over all those invaders. And inside our body, those are called macrophages. The one thing that you don't really see here is the intelligence war that goes on. If you're ever invaded, or your body's invaded by a certain infection, you will never get infected or realize that you've been infected by that virus again. In other words, if you get a cold, you're never going to get that same cold again. And so same thing goes within a castle. A castle has an intelligence system. It's recognizing those invaders and making sure that we're never infected by that again. And so this would be our skin. So here's our skin. It offers protection from any invader. But let's say that you have you stepped on a nail, or there's some kind of a pin that's gone through our skin, and some of these bacteria have actually breached that wall, and so they're inside our body. Well, these are the soldiers inside our body. These are called macrophages, and macrophages are white blood cells that'll leak out of our capillaries, and it'll actually engulf all those bacteria. Now, another cool thing that's happening that's not shown in this diagram is not only do they engulf them, but they will chop them up and present parts of them on the surface of the macrophage. And the reason they do that will become apparent in just a couple of slides. Or this slide, excuse me. There are a couple of terms that you really want to understand. The first one is called antigen, and the second one is called antibody. And so this is a lymphocyte. A lymphocyte is going to be a white blood cell specialized for recognizing invaders if they come back again. And it produces antibodies on its surface. Antibodies form when you have an antigen. So an antigen is any invader. It could be a bacteria, it could be a virus, it could be a worm, it could be some kind of debris, but whatever it is, an antigen essentially generates antibodies. And so what is an antibody? Antibodies are these proteins, and they always look like a Y kind of a shape, but the important part of the antibodies are going to be at the top. And so our body literally has millions and millions of different antibody shapes that we're born with. But the tips of these antibodies are each going to be different. And so if this is an antibody, if you look way up here, in the antibodies in our body, if my arms represent the antibodies, we have literally millions and millions of different shapes at the end of our antibodies. And so if you have an invader, let's say we have an invader that is shaped like my head, this kind of an antibody might not fit on it, but if I get the right antibody, it'll fit perfectly with that antigen. And then our body springs into action. In other words, if I've gotten a virus, let's say I have a cold, for example, and I have this virus, once we recognize the exact shape of that virus, it's important that our body does two things. Number one, we want to make a whole bunch of those antibodies. And the other thing is we want to hold on to memory cells so that we can never be infected by that again. Now, where do all these white blood cells, lymphocytes sit if they're not just right where that infection is? Well, we have this whole system called the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system kind of runs in concert with the circulatory system. So as material moves, liquid material moves out of the circulatory system into that interstitial fluid, it'll eventually move through the lymphatic system, it'll eventually move through these lymph nodes, and then back into the circulatory system again. And these lymph nodes are full with phagocytes or macrophages and lymphocytes, and what they're doing is looking for infection, and then they're going to fight that infection and get rid of it. And that's why if you have some kind of infection, you go to the doctor, they're looking right here for those lymph nodes or right here for those lymph nodes to see if they're swollen, and that just suggests that we have some kind of an infection. Now there are two different ways that we fight infection once we've had it and we don't want to get it again. And these are sometimes confusing, but this diagram I think is probably the best one that I've found that kind of summarizes the two of these. We have two different responses. The first one is called the humoral response. Humoral response comes from the word humors, which just means liquids of our body. And so think of this as that they've breached the castle, they're inside the wall, they're throughout our body, and we're finding any invader and killing them in the humors, or the open areas of our body. And the cells that are important for that are what are called B lymphocytes, and the way I remember B lymphocytes is they're secreted or made in the bone marrow, and they're important in the humoral response. The other response is the cell-mediated response. Cell-mediated response is going to be finding the cells inside our body that are infected. So we can think of them as like moles within the castle that were helping the invaders, finding all of them and killing them. And the cells that are important here are T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are actually made in the thymus, is a good way to remember that. And so if we kind of summarize that, what happens with infection, and I'll show you this again on the next slide, B cells will realize the shape of those invaders. They'll give rise to antibodies which will bind to those invaders and sometimes hold them together, and then it makes it easier for those macrophages to eat them. They also, B lymphocytes, will give rise to memory B cells, and those memory B cells stay within our body for years and years, and sometimes our lifetime. And so if we're ever infected by that again, this whole cycle can go quickly. Now if we look on the cell-mediated side, we have what are called cytotoxic T cells. And so this right here is a cytotoxic, or excuse me, this is a cell that's been infected, and this is a cytotoxic T cell, and what it's going to do is it's going to kill one of our own cells that's infected by a virus, or it's going to kill like cancerous cells inside our body. And so what they do is they make active cytotoxic T cells and then memory T cells so that we can do that same fight if it ever comes back again. Now right in the middle here we have what are called helper T cells. Helper T cells are really important in stimulating B cells to do the humoral response, and also cytotoxic T cells. And so if you know anything about AIDS or HIV, the problem with HIV is that it infects these helper T cells, which sit right in the middle of both the humoral response and the cell-mediated. This really is a nice diagram of what happens in the humoral response. Here's a macrophage eating that infection. Remember, it chops up the bacteria and presents its shape on its surface. That activates a T helper cell, which is going to tell the B cells, it's going to help those B cells to make both more memory cells, so we can have those cells to fight infection in the future, and then plasma cells, which are going to make a bunch of antibodies. Remember, that'll mark these bacteria, so it makes them easier to be eaten by macrophages. And the cell-mediated, what happens here is that we've got the T cell again noticing that shape, it's activating a cytotoxic T cell, and that cytotoxic T cell is actually killing the cells inside our body that are infected by that virus or that infected by that cell. Now, an interesting thing here is this process of enveloping our cells and producing them on our surface not only is important in fighting infection, but it also recognizes our tissue. And that's why if you were ever to take a heart, for example, from someone else and put it inside your body, our body's going to recognize that it's non-self, and we're going to attack that. And so this diagram here really summarizes that. So this is the first time I get a cold, I'm infected, I'll make antibodies, and then I'll get better after time. If I'm ever exposed to that same virus again, I'll make so many antibodies so quickly, since I have memory cells of that, I'm never even going to feel that I'm getting that cold. I'll just get over it very quickly. Now, sometimes our body attacks itself. In other words, sometimes the guards inside the castle attack the castle itself. And we call those autoimmune disorders. Example of would be rheumatoid arthritis, when your body's actually attacking the tissues. And we're finding that many disorders, heart disease is an example of one, have links to this autoimmune problem when our body starts to turn on itself. So that's an introduction to the immune system, and I hope that